Here I am.
Hello, good morning.
Hello, good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Good. So I'll try and figure out how to hold my phone in a way that
Yeah,
works.
it's a skill that, yeah, yeah,
I think I lack this skill. I lack this skill, but I'll try and learn.
no worries. So it's our 21st niche conversation.
Hey,
Um,
congratulations.
I'm Jessica DeWitts. I'm one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment.
Mhm.
And today I am joined by Adele Perry. And would you like to tell us more about yourself?
Sure. I'm Adele Perry. I am non-Indigenous. I am a historian and sort of a scholar of long histories of colonialism and of gender, especially in Western Northern North America in the 19th and 20th centuries. I've lived here in Treaty 1 territory for a little over 20 years,
Mhm.
and I work on a range of issues, and the one that we're going to be talking about today has to do with kind of histories of water and their relationship to sort of settler colonialism in general, and in particular in the city of Winnipeg.
Yeah, so I think it was in 2017 you wrote a blog post called Water and the Infrastructure of Colonialism.
Right.
And then you wrote this book, Aqueduct.
Yes, that's
Um,
right.
it's a, and we included it in our list of 10 books to contextualize environmental racism in North America last
Right.
summer. Um, so I thought that we would start today off by just talking about what this aqueduct is. What is the Winnipeg slash
Sure.
Shoal aqueduct?
Yeah.
Aqueduct.
For sure. The it's called both the Shoal Lake Aqueduct and the Winnipeg Aqueduct, and they both of those names speak to the kind of the way that it's about both of the histories of both of those places. So
Mhm.
it is the piece of infrastructure that delivers drinking and domestic water in general to the city of Winnipeg, and has done so since 1919, so a little over 100 years. The 100 years that passed since the general strike in Winnipeg in 1919 was commemorated pretty widely and loudly.
Mhm.
The marking of 100 years since we've had drinking water from Shoal Lake was a little bit less kind of marked in the last couple of years, but it's been over 100 years, and it is an enormous piece of infrastructure. On one hand, it's pretty basic and plain. It's made of concrete. It runs about 150 kilometers, linking the city of Winnipeg to the kind of westernmost edge of the Lake of the Woods watershed. And so, what it essentially allows the city of Winnipeg to do is to sort of access drinking water from what is a different geography from any number of different perspectives.
Mhm.
Including just sort of what the character of sort of the land and the water and those things. But it also links different political and social communities. So, when we give territorial acknowledgements in Winnipeg, one of the things that we say is that we're on Treaty 1 land, but we drink water from Treaty 3. And that, in a sense, ties these places together in this radically unequal relationship of colonialism in ways that are really enduring.
Mhm.
So the aqueduct was built between 1913 and 1919. Is an idea that was floated from the 1880s onward, but it kind of found a new audience, and it found funding because it was not cheap. It was expensive, and it was acknowledged by all concerned as to be this kind of really expensive and ambitious project.
Mhm.
And it was sort of carried throughout the years of World War I, and then completed in 1919. It was at the time described sometimes as the biggest piece of public works in the British Empire. It's hard to know if that's really true, or if that's just kind of the requisite boosterism of the day. But it was certainly an enormous project. It employed like more than 1,000 men at certain periods of time working on it. They crossed numerous bodies of water. It was a huge undertaking. It involved many levels of the settler state, including the provinces of
Mhm.
Manitoba and Ontario, because Shoal Lake borders the two provinces and is mainly in Ontario. It involved the federal government. It involved the Joint Boundary Commission, which had been set up a little bit before to govern bodies of water claimed by both the United States and Canada. And because Lake of the Woods is an international water supply, it included under that. It involved in very real ways the federal government. So it involved this kind of huge project that was about the city of Winnipeg, but it was actually about a much wider kind of coordination of kind of the settler state.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about how this relates to these discussions of borders that we've been having on NiCHE lately,
Sure.
how borders are, fake. So these supposed borders of Treaty 1, Treaty 3 of the US and Canada, this project shows that they are malleable, and we break through them all the time with with culture, with people, with these
Sure.
infrastructure projects. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And it also gets us, I think, to think differently about jurisdiction.
mhm.
And that's something that, legal scholars and other people deal with a lot. And one of the things that I take from Sherry Pasternak talks about kind of jurisdiction as being a way of organizing power,
Mm.
and ways of kind of organizing relations of authority. But it's ways that are and can be and regularly are kind of remade in these sorts of contexts.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah. So in Aqueduct, you state
Yeah.
the aqueduct is Canadian colonialism in scale, model, and technicolor.
Hmm.
I thought maybe you could elaborate on that point and maybe talk to us about how this piece of infrastructure is also a piece of colonialism.
Sure. Yeah, so it is absolutely both. And I think infrastructure is completely key to kind of creating a lived experience of colonialism that
Mhm.
naturalizes Indigenous dispossession and loss and makes it seem invisible.
Mm.
And particularly for non-Indigenous people, like myself, renders it kind of an invisible kind of part of our daily lives. That then we have to be kind of pushed by Indigenous communities and people to really see. So I think infrastructure is a really kind of critical way that really just makes those relations possible.
Mhm.
So that in the way the aqueduct is an example of this kind of par excellence is that it is based on, at its core, what it does is it removes a resource from an Indigenous community and relocates it to a settler one. And then it does so in a way that it appears to appear kind of seamless and natural.
Mhm.
So one of the historians that I was reading when I worked on the book said that you could define modernity by not knowing where your drinking water came from. And I think that's a really interesting kind of way to think about the way that water kind of fits in social history of the modern. But I think in particular, too, this is clear that it is also profoundly about colonialism. So I think the lived experience of kind of modern settler colonialism in Canada and the city of Winnipeg is that our drinking water is rooted and continues to be produced and perpetually reproduced in this cycle of Indigenous dispossession and loss to empower a settler community and make its life easier and healthier and nicer in so many ways. And that is kind of rendered invisible. And the aqueduct is also kind of a scale model of Canadian colonialism just because it involves all of these things that are kind of iconic. They built a railroad to sort of transport goods from the city of Winnipeg to the aqueduct that still actually runs twice a week to transport supplies to the intake of the aqueduct. It involved the coercive powers of the Indian Act, and in particular, a section of the Indian Act that was in play in those years that allowed the federal government to agree to land loss to reserve communities without any consultation or process whatsoever if it was deemed necessary for quote unquote public works, which were, of course, necessarily settler public works. And it involved in lots of ways a lot of just kind of the grand and dangerous thinking of kind of ambitious capitalist colonial men who kind of
Mhm.
held sway in the discourse. They talked about Shoal Lake all the time. They talked about how wonderful its water was, what a beautiful place it was. And they regularly and kind of conclusively dismissed the people that were there, even though they were very clearly there. And the people that were doing that were, I think, really aware of it in some respects, but they were very much part of this discourse that rendered Indigenous people and communities and their histories and their sovereignty and their rights invisible. And I think the consequences of that are then, 100 years where people don't know where their water came from. The consequences of that in other contexts are, non-Indigenous people not being aware of which Indigenous territories they're living in, or what the Indigenous languages are, or
Mm-hmm.
unable to say any of those words, that kind of thing. So I think it's just an example of the way that colonialism becomes kind of bred to the bone, and also kind of marked as invisible. And it does so through many things, but infrastructure is one of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It gets me thinking about in my own work. I've looked at dams more,
Oh, yeah.
and I remember H.V. Nells and Christopher Armstrong talk about how like the dams in Banff have become part of the landscape that people
Mm-hmm.
don't notice them.
No,
And it's kind of similar with this aqueduct is part of the landscape. People probably don't really notice it, don't think about it, don't think about what it's doing.
sure.
And that going beyond, I mean, that's important because we're transgressing the ideas of natural and kind
Mm-hmm.
of redefining what natural is. But
Sure.
we like the aqueduct is making me think how we need to move even further beyond that and think about the consequences of what transgressing this idea of natural is. And that there's real human and non-human consequences,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a set of colonial context. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, the particular piece in this context is that the land loss that was sort of facilitated by the federal government, using the powers of the Indian Act, involved really critical pieces of Shoal Lake 40 First Nations reserve. And what it more or less did was trisect the reserve into kind of three pieces. And what that eventually kind of did through sort of a series of kind of knock-on effects is leave them basically on an artificial island. And then that very much contributed to their status as a waterless First Nation. And on one hand, they're not alone in that. There's many First Nations across Canada that have poor or no clean drinking water. And that's kind of become iconic, I think, of sort of the failures of Canadian modernity to deliver in even the most modest ways for Indigenous people, and particularly for First Nations people on reserve. But I think it stands in really clear kind of ways about the way that basically the city of Winnipeg, the sort of what is the settler community, solves its problems regarding water at the very direct expense of Indigenous ones. So it's one of those things. I spent a while talking to kids about it quite a lot, and whether you can explain things to kids is always a really good kind of marker of what makes sense and what doesn't. And kids would often kids often respond to that by saying like, so wait, like we drink their water but they can't, and it's like, yeah, exactly. And that tells you a lot. And it's not unique. There's lots of communities in northern Manitoba, for instance, that have been dispossessed through damming and hydro development projects that are off the grid, that don't have electricity. And they're obviously landlessness is kind of a core part of all of these histories. But I think there's something about the intimacy of water, and how I think we know how much water is key to sort of our health and our quality of life. That it really speaks, I think, to the sort of the profound inequalities that kind of colonialism has structured our lives into, in kind of ways that are enduring, I think, and that matter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think many of us could even imagine not having water at our disposal whenever we want it, and it's a exercise of privilege or white dominance to even be able to do that exercise in one's mind. I know in the contemporary context, there's a lot of criticism of the Trudeau government for failing on their promise to fix this problem in Canada, to make sure all Indigenous communities have access to clean, potable drinking water. You wouldn't think that'd be that difficult, but apparently it is. So you published Aqueduct and this blog post in 2016 and 2017. So 4 or 5 years have gone by. So I thought we'd end by maybe if you could touch upon what has changed since you published the book, or happened since.
Right. So, those were years that saw, I think, this sort of increased attention to these questions of Indigenous communities, in particular First Nations on reserve, lacking decent drinking water. And it becoming kind of a real powerful symbol of where Indigenous people and issues fit within Canada. And we saw the Trudeau government be elected for its first term on a promise of bringing clean water to First Nations. And I think what we've seen since then is that those histories are very much produced through 150 years of radical inequality, of a massive infrastructure deficit, that it's not just simply kind of about sort of flipping a switch and saying this can happen. It is about ways in which reserves have been rendered difficult to live in. And that is not an accident, that is the part of the way that these relations have been structured, and that undoing that or addressing that in meaningful ways is a project that is clearly kind of beyond kind of easy political promises. So for a while, when they were mapping their success and getting rid of long-term drinking water advisories, the government had that they would get rid of some, but then they would add some others. There was some investigative journalism done by Martha Troyan at APTN, who suggested that, in fact, what was happening a lot of the time is that what had been long-term drinking water advisories were being redescribed or recategorized as short-term ones. So some have been added. The numbers are kind of slowly, I think, moving, but it's very, very slow. And we are now kind of past the date that they said that this would all be kind of sorted out. And I think there's been some recent releases just in the last day or two, which suggests that they're looking at another 5 years. But I guess what I would sort of say, and all this is what I think is clear, is that the absence of kind of decent drinking water on reserves is indicative of a much wider set of, enormously unequal and difficult social and economic and political relationships that makes life in those communities really hard. And that is kind of produced through the really sort of central kind of histories of colonialism. And what we've really seen in these last couple of years, that it can't be undone by just sort of a putative commitment to addressing one piece in it. Mm-hmm. So in the particular context, Shoal Lake 40's status as a waterless community in the South, and so sometimes in the national kind of media landscape, it's described as remote. But, you can hear the Trans-Canada Highway from Shoal Lake 40. It's near very swanky cottages that many kind of well-heeled people in Winnipeg regularly go to. So its status in that category was tied very much to their lack of year-round secure road access, and for a demand to have road access, and it became known as Freedom Road, and it was named by the community. So Freedom Road now exists. It was completed in 2019. So that wasn't the case when I wrote the book. I rewrote the introduction to the book a couple of times because the basic landscape kept on changing. Mm-hmm. But that now exists. They are building a water treatment plant on Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. It has been slowed down by a number of things, most notably by COVID and lockdowns, and the COVID-related protocols that they have adopted in an effort to, try and minimize the impact of the virus on the community. So as of today, they still are on a drinking water advisory. So I think now that would be 23 years. And there's, I think, work for historians to do to think a little bit about why so many communities water advisories at a certain point in time. It's kind of the years in the wake of the Walkerton crisis in Southern Ontario. There's an interesting article published in the Journal of Canadian Studies by Laurie Chamber on the relationship between the Walkerton crisis and then the comparative case of Pikangikum First Nation around similar periods of time. But I think what we see is that these communities that are on long-term drinking water advisories, and then Shoal Lake 40 is one of them, the reasons that led them to those that place are not easy to undo within the framework that we have.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, we still have a lot of work to do.
Yes,
Matt,
certainly that.
um, well, I want to thank you for joining me today.
Yeah,
It was a really enlightening conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I suggest that everyone head over to our website and read your
sure.
blog post as well
Great.
as your book.
Sure.
It's a very accessible book. It's always brought up as an example of accessible history
Yeah.
because it's you can read it in one evening if you really want to. I
Yeah.
think I did because I
Mm.
got invested in it, but
Yeah.
I think people can really gain a lot from it. So I want to thank you,
Yeah. Thanks, Jessica. Okay.
Adele.
Bye.